The autumn mist clung to the rolling hills of Montgomery County like a shroud, obscuring the scattered farmsteads that dotted the Tennessee countryside. Reverend Samuel Whitmore adjusted his black coat against the October chill as his horse picked its way along the muddy road toward Clarksville. The year 1849 had brought unusual hardships to this remote corner of the state: failed crops, mysterious illnesses, and whispered tales that made even the most God-fearing folk cross themselves in the darkness. Samuel had been summoned by the local congregation, desperate for spiritual guidance in what they described as troubling times. At 28, he was young for such responsibility, but his fervent sermons and unwavering faith had earned him a reputation throughout the region. What he didn't expect was the palpable fear that seemed to permeate the very air as he approached the settlement. The first person he encountered was Martha Henley, a weathered woman in her 50s who ran the general store. Her eyes darted nervously as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper despite the empty store. "Reverend, I pray you can bring some peace to this place," she said, wringing her hands. "Things ain't been right since the Moorfields came back." "The Moorfields?" Samuel inquired, setting down his travel bag. Martha's face paled. "Been here nigh on 15 years now. Ezekiel Moorfield and his kin. They keep to themselves mostly, out on that big spread near Dunbar Cave. But lately," she trailed off, glancing toward the window, as if expecting to see someone listening. "What about them troubles you, Mrs. Henley?" "It's the help they hire," she whispered. "Young folks mostly. Drifters, immigrants, sometimes local boys needing work. They go out to that farm and—" she shuddered. "They don't come back. Not the same anyway. Some don't come back at all." Samuel frowned. "Have you spoken to the sheriff, Sheriff Caldwell?" Martha let out a bitter laugh. "He won't go near that place. Says it's outside his jurisdiction, but we all know better. The Moorfields, they got money, Reverend, old money. And in these parts, that buys a lot of silence." As if summoned by their conversation, the door chimed, and a young man stumbled in. His clothes were torn, his face gaunt and hollow-eyed. Samuel recognized the look. He'd seen it in soldiers returning from the Mexican War, men who'd witnessed horrors that words couldn't capture. "Tommy," Martha gasped. "Tommy Brennan? Lord have mercy, where have you been?" The young man, barely 20 by Samuel's estimation, swayed on his feet. His lips moved soundlessly for a moment before he managed to speak. The Moorfield place," he croaked. I was working there, but I had to leave, had to run." His eyes found Samuel's clerical collar, and he grabbed the preacher's arm with desperate strength. "Father, you got to warn people. That family, what they do in that house, it ain't natural. It ain't Christian." "What did you see, son?" Samuel asked gently. Tommy's grip tightened. "Things a man shouldn't see, things that happen between family that go against God's law. And they made me... He broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Martha quickly ushered the young man to a chair, shooting Samuel a meaningful look. "This is the third one this month," she murmured. "The ones that do come back, they're all like this. Broken." Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. In his years of ministry, he'd encountered many forms of human wickedness, but something about this situation felt different, darker. "Where exactly is this Moorfield farm?" he asked. "About 8 miles north, past the old mill road," Martha replied. "But Reverend, I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Henley, but if there are souls in need of salvation, it's my duty to reach them." Samuel gathered his belongings. "I'll need directions to the church first. I assume there's somewhere I can stay?" "The parsonage is behind the church, but it's been empty for months. The last preacher—" She glanced at Tommy, who was still shaking. "He went to visit the Moorfields too. Found him 3 days later, wandering the woods naked as the day he was born, speaking in tongues. Not the holy kind, if you catch my meaning." Samuel nodded grimly. "Nevertheless, I must try. Evil flourishes when good men do nothing." As he prepared to leave, Tommy grabbed his sleeve again. "If you go there," he whispered urgently, "don't eat their food, don't drink their wine, and whatever you do, don't stay after dark. That's when the family gathers." The young man's words echoed in Samuel's mind as he made his way through the town. Clarksville was larger than he'd expected, with nearly 1,000 residents, but an oppressive quiet hung over the streets. People hurried about their business with downcast eyes, and more than once he caught groups of townspeople breaking off their conversations as he passed. The church was a modest wooden structure with a tall steeple that seemed to pierce the grey sky. Inside, Samuel found it well maintained but eerily empty. The parsonage, as Martha had warned, showed signs of hasty abandonment, personal belongings scattered about, a half-eaten meal still on the table, now covered in mold. As evening approached, Samuel knelt in prayer before the altar. The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on the walls, and he found himself thinking of Tommy's haunted eyes, of Martha's fearful whispers, of a family whose very name seemed to inspire terror in an entire community. "Lord," he prayed aloud, his voice echoing in the empty sanctuary, "grant me the strength to face whatever darkness awaits. If there are lost souls to be saved, let me be your instrument." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and causing the candle flames to dance more wildly. In the distance, barely audible above the wind, Samuel could have sworn he heard the sound of laughter, low, throaty, and utterly without joy. Tomorrow he would ride to the Moorfield farm. Tonight he would prepare his soul for whatever unholy practices he might encounter. But as he tried to sleep in the abandoned parsonage, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that he was already being watched, that his arrival in Clarksville had not gone unnoticed by the very people he sought to confront. In the darkness beyond the town, on a sprawling farm near Dunbar Cave, the Moorfield family was indeed aware of the new preacher's presence, and they were making preparations of their own. The morning sun struggled through the persistent mist as Samuel rode north from Clarksville, following the directions Martha Henley had reluctantly provided. The road grew progressively worse as he traveled, eventually becoming little more than a dirt track rutted by wagon wheels and scarred by recent rains. Ancient oak trees formed a canopy overhead, their gnarled branches creating an almost tunnel-like effect that blocked out much of the daylight. After nearly 2 hours of riding, Samuel came upon a weathered wooden sign, its paint faded and peeling. Moorfield Estate, private property. Beyond it, a long drive wound through overgrown fields toward a large house barely visible in the distance. What struck him immediately was the silence. No bird song, no rustling of small animals, even the usual buzz of insects seemed muted here. The house, when it finally came into view, was an imposing 2-story structure built in the federal style popular decades earlier. White columns supported a broad front porch, but the paint was peeling and several shutters hung askew. Despite its obvious age and neglect, the building retained an air of former grandeur that spoke of significant wealth. As Samuel approached, he noticed several outbuildings scattered around the property, a large barn, what appeared to be servants' quarters, and a smaller structure whose purpose he couldn't immediately determine. Smoke rose from the main house's chimney, and he could see movement behind the windows, confirming that the family was indeed in residence. He had barely dismounted when the front door opened, and a man emerged onto the porch. Ezekiel Moorfield was tall and lean, probably in his 50s, with prematurely grey hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He was well dressed in a dark suit that, while not new, was of obvious quality. "Reverend Whitmore, I presume?" Ezekiel's voice was cultured, with only the slightest trace of a southern accent. "Word travels quickly in these parts. I've been expecting you." Samuel felt a momentary surprise at being recognized, but quickly recovered. "Mr. Moorfield, I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit. I'm new to the area and thought it proper to introduce myself to all the families in my parish." Of course. Please come in. My family will be delighted to meet you." Ezekiel's smile was warm, but something in his eyes remained cold and calculating. "I trust your journey wasn't too difficult. These roads can be treacherous, especially for someone unfamiliar with the area." As they entered the house, Samuel was struck by the contrast between the exterior's decay and the interior's opulence. Rich carpets covered polished hardwood floors, and the walls were adorned with oil paintings and expensive furnishings. Everything was immaculately clean and well-maintained, suggesting a large household staff. "You have a beautiful home," Samuel observed. "Thank you. It's been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather built it when he first came to Tennessee from Virginia. We've made some modifications over the years, but the basic structure remains unchanged." Ezekiel led him into a spacious parlor where a fire crackled in an ornate fireplace. "Please sit. I'll have my wife prepare some refreshments." As if summoned by his words, a woman appeared in the doorway. Constance Moorfield was perhaps 45. Still handsome despite the hardness around her eyes. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her black dress, while fashionable, seemed more appropriate for morning than afternoon entertaining. "My dear, this is Reverend Whitmore, the new minister in Clarksville," Ezekiel said. "Reverend, my wife Constance." "A pleasure," Constance said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I'll have Mercy bring some tea and cakes." "That's very kind, but not necessary," Samuel began, remembering Tommy's warning about accepting food or drink. "Nonsense," Ezekiel insisted. "We so rarely have visitors, especially men of the cloth. It would be our honor to show proper hospitality." Before Samuel could protest further, a young woman entered carrying a silver tea service. She was perhaps 18, with auburn hair and green eyes, but there was something unsettling about her demeanor, a nervous energy that reminded him of a caged animal. "This is Mercy," Constance said. "She helps with the household duties." The girl, Mercy, set down the tray with hands that trembled slightly. As she poured the tea, Samuel noticed what appeared to be bruises on her wrists, partially hidden by her long sleeves. "Are you from the area, Mercy?" Samuel asked gently. The girl's eyes darted to Ezekiel before she answered. "Yes, sir. From down near the river. My family, they needed the money, so I came to work here." "How long have you been with the Moorfields?" Again, that nervous glance. "About 6 months, sir." "Mercy is quite devoted to our family," Constance interjected smoothly. "Aren't you, dear?" "Yes, ma'am," Mercy whispered, but Samuel caught the fear in her voice. As they talked, Samuel became aware of other sounds in the house, footsteps overhead, muffled voices, and occasionally what sounded like crying. When he mentioned it, Ezekiel waved dismissively. "My children, 3 boys and 2 girls, ranging in age from 15 to 25. They're energetic." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps you'd like to meet them." "I'd be honored," Ezekiel called out, and soon the parlor filled with the Moorfield offspring. The eldest, Jeremiah, was a tall young man with his father's pale eyes and an unsettling intensity. The twins, Caleb and Cain, were perhaps 20, identical except for a scar that ran down Cain's left cheek. The daughters, Delilah and Bathsheba, were beautiful but shared their mother's hard expression. What disturbed Samuel most was the way they looked at each other, not with the casual affection of siblings, but with something far more intimate and inappropriate. He noticed how Jeremiah's hand lingered on Delilah's shoulder, how the twins stood closer to Bathsheba than propriety would suggest. "We're a very close family," Ezekiel said, as if reading Samuel's thoughts. "We believe in keeping our bloodline pure, our traditions intact. In these modern times, it's important to preserve the old ways." "The old ways?" Samuel asked carefully. "Family loyalty. Devotion, the understanding that some bonds transcend society's limitations. Ezekiel's voice took on an almost hypnotic quality. You see, Reverend, we Moorfields have always believed that love, true love, knows no boundaries, that the deepest intimacy can only be achieved between those who share the same blood, the same heritage. Samuel felt his stomach turn as the implications became clear. Mr. Moorfield, surely you're not suggesting— I'm suggesting nothing, Ezekiel said smoothly. Merely explaining our family's philosophy. We've found that conventional morality often stands in the way of true spiritual enlightenment. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from upstairs, shouting, followed by what sounded like a struggle. Constance rose quickly. I should check on that, she said, but Ezekiel gestured for her to remain seated. It's nothing, my dear, just the new boy adjusting to his duties. He turned to Samuel with that cold smile. We recently hired another farmhand. Young men from the city sometimes find rural life challenging. Samuel thought of Tommy Brennan's haunted eyes and felt a chill run down his spine. Perhaps I should be going. I don't want to impose on your family time. But you've barely touched your tea, Delilah said, moving closer to him. Her voice was sultry, inappropriate for someone addressing a minister. Surely you can stay a little longer. I'm afraid I have other visits to make, Samuel said, standing quickly. Thank you for your hospitality. As Ezekiel walked him to the door, the older man placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder. Reverend, I hope our conversation hasn't disturbed you. We're simply a family that believes in being true to our nature, regardless of what others might think. Mr. Moorfield, if there are practices in this house that go against God's law— God's law? Ezekiel's laugh was soft but chilling. Tell me, Reverend, have you ever considered that perhaps God's law is more flexible than the church would have us believe? That love, in all its forms, might be divine? Samuel mounted his horse, his hands shaking slightly. I'll pray for your family, Mr. Moorfield. And we'll pray for you, Reverend. We'll pray that you come to understand the true nature of devotion. As Samuel rode away, he could feel eyes watching him from the house's windows. The mist seemed thicker now, and the silence more oppressive. Behind him, the Moorfield estate disappeared into the grey afternoon, but the memory of what he'd witnessed, the inappropriate touches, the fearful servants, the family's disturbing philosophy, burned in his mind like a brand. He had come seeking souls to save, but Samuel was beginning to realize that some darkness ran too deep for redemption. The question now was whether he had the strength to confront it, or whether the Moorfield legacy would claim another victim. As evening approached and he neared Clarksville, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that his visit had been more than a social call. It had been an evaluation, and somehow he suspected he had failed their test. 3 days had passed since Samuel's visit to the Moorfield estate, and sleep had become elusive. Each night brought the same disturbing dreams, images of the family's inappropriate intimacy, Mercy's frightened eyes, and the sounds of struggle from the upper floors. During the day, he threw himself into his ministerial duties, but the townspeople's fearful whispers only reinforced his growing conviction that something truly evil was taking place at that isolated farm. On Thursday evening, as Samuel prepared for bed in the parsonage, a soft knocking at his door interrupted his prayers. He opened it to find Mercy standing in the shadows, her face pale and streaked with tears. She wore only a thin shawl over her nightgown, and her feet were bare despite the October chill. "Reverend," she whispered urgently, "please, I need sanctuary. I can't go back there. I can't." Samuel quickly ushered her inside, wrapping his coat around her trembling shoulders. "Child, what's happened? Are you hurt?" Mercy collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably. When she finally composed herself enough to speak, her words came in broken fragments that painted a picture of horror beyond Samuel's worst imaginings. The family, they do things," she stammered. Unholy things. Brother with sister, father with daughter. They say it's their way, their tradition, but it's wrong. It's evil. Samuel knelt beside her chair, his voice gentle but urgent. Tell me everything, child. You're safe here. I've been there 6 months, Mercy began, her voice barely audible. At first it seemed normal, hard work but honest. But then I started noticing things, the way they looked at each other, touched each other. And at night, she shuddered, at night I could hear them, all of them, together. Together how? In ways that ain't natural between family. Jeremiah with his sisters, the twins with their mother, even old Ezekiel with... She couldn't finish the sentence. Samuel felt sick. Did they force you to participate? Mercy's silence was answer enough. Fresh tears streamed down her face as she nodded. They said it was part of my duties, that if I wanted to stay, if I wanted to eat, I had to join their rituals. They called it family worship, but it wasn't worship of God. What about the other servants, the young men who've gone missing? Some ran away, like Tommy Brennan, but others... Mercy's voice dropped to a whisper. Others who tried to leave or threatened to tell people what they'd seen, they disappeared. Ezekiel said they'd been sent away, but I found things. Clothes buried in the woods, personal belongings hidden in the barn. Samuel's blood ran cold. You think they were killed? I know they were. There's a place on the property, near the cave. Ezekiel calls it the sacred ground. I've seen him and the boys dragging bundles there at night, and the smell, she gagged, the smell that comes from that direction when the wind shifts. Samuel stood and began pacing, his mind racing. This was beyond mere moral corruption. This was murder, possibly multiple murders. But who would believe such an accusation against one of the county's wealthiest families? Mercy, you said they called it family worship. What exactly did they do? They have ceremonies, she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke, usually on the new moon. The whole family gathers in the cellar. There's a room down there that's been changed, symbols painted on the walls, candles everywhere, and an altar made of black stone. What kind of symbols? Not Christian ones, strange markings that hurt to look at. Ezekiel says they're from the old country, from his grandfather's time. He claims their family has special blood, that they're chosen for something greater than ordinary people. Samuel remembered Ezekiel's words about keeping the bloodline pure and felt his stomach turn. What happens during these ceremonies? Mercy's face went ashen. They couple with each other, all of them. While Ezekiel reads from an old book written in a language I don't recognize, he says it's to strengthen the family bond, to keep their power concentrated. But it's not just the family members. What do you mean? They force the servants to watch, sometimes to participate. They say it's an honor, that we're being blessed by witnessing their sacred traditions. But anyone who shows disgust or tries to leave, she trailed off. They disappear. Samuel finished grimly. There's more, Mercy continued. Constance is with child again, has been for about 4 months, but she's not sure which of her sons is the father. They celebrate this, say it proves their bloodline is strong. Samuel felt bile rise in his throat. The level of depravity was beyond anything he'd encountered in his ministry. How many servants are there now? Just 3 of us left. Me, a boy named Peter who came last month, and an older woman named Ruth who's been there 2 years. Ruth, she's different now, broken. She does whatever they ask without question. We have to go to the authorities, Mercy laughed bitterly. With what proof? My word against theirs. Reverend, they own half the county. Sheriff Caldwell won't even ride out there, and the judge is Ezekiel's cousin. Besides, who's going to believe such a story? Samuel knew she was right, but he couldn't simply ignore what he'd learned. There has to be something we can do. There is, Mercy said quietly, but it's dangerous. Tomorrow night is the new moon. They'll have another ceremony. If someone could witness it, document what happens. You want me to spy on them? It's the only way to get proof. But Reverend, if they catch you, She didn't need to finish the sentence. Samuel spent the rest of the night in prayer, wrestling with his conscience. By morning, his decision was made. He would return to the Moorfield estate, not as a minister making social calls, but as an agent of justice seeking evidence of their crimes. He spent Friday preparing, gathering supplies and studying maps of the area around Dunbar Cave. Mercy provided detailed information about the layout of the house and the location of the cellar room where the ceremonies took place. She also warned him about the family's habits. They rarely left the property, but when they did, it was usually in the late afternoon. As evening approached, Samuel felt a mixture of fear and determination. He was about to confront evil in its purest form, but he was also potentially walking into a trap that could cost him his life. Still, the memory of Tommy Brennan's haunted eyes and Mercy's desperate plea for sanctuary drove him forward. The sun was setting as he made his final preparations, checking his pocket watch and ensuring his writing materials were secure. In a few hours, he would learn the full extent of the Moorfield family's depravity. What he didn't know was that his previous visit had not gone unnoticed, and that the family was already preparing for his return. In the cellar of the Moorfield estate, Ezekiel was making his own preparations for the evening ceremony. But tonight would be different from the others. Tonight, they would have a very special guest, whether he knew it or not. The moon was nothing more than a sliver of silver in the cloudy October sky as Samuel made his way through the woods surrounding the Moorfield estate. He had left his horse tied nearly a mile away and approached on foot, using the cover of darkness and his knowledge of the property layout to avoid detection. The autumn air was sharp with the scent of dying leaves and something else, something foul that seemed to emanate from the direction of Dunbar Cave. Samuel had been watching the house for over an hour from his concealed position behind a cluster of oak trees. Lights flickered in the windows, and he could see figures moving about inside. According to Mercy's information, the family would gather in the cellar around midnight for their unholy ceremony. It was now nearly 11:30. As he crept closer to the house, Samuel noticed that the usual sounds of night, owls hooting, insects chirping, small animals rustling through the underbrush, were completely absent. The silence was so profound, it seemed to press against his eardrums like a physical weight. Even his own breathing sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness. The cellar entrance Mercy had described was on the north side of the house, hidden behind a trellis covered with dead vines. Samuel found it easily enough, a heavy wooden door set into the foundation, with stone steps leading down into darkness. He tested the door and found it unlocked, which struck him as odd, until he realized that the family probably never expected anyone to be bold enough to spy on them. The steps were worn smooth by generations of use, and Samuel descended carefully, feeling his way along the stone walls. The air grew colder as he went deeper, and that foul smell became stronger, a mixture of decay, sulfur, and something else he couldn't identify, but that made his stomach churn. At the bottom of the steps, Samuel found himself in a narrow corridor lit by torches mounted in iron brackets. The walls were rough-hewn stone, much older than the house above, suggesting this part of the structure predated the current building. Following Mercy's directions, he made his way toward the sound of voices coming from deeper in the cellar. The corridor opened into a large chamber that took Samuel's breath away, not from beauty, but from the sheer wrongness of what he saw. The room was circular, perhaps 30 feet across, with a domed ceiling that disappeared into shadows above the torchlight. The walls were covered with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering flames. Not painted, Samuel realized, but carved deep into the stone and filled with what looked like dried blood. In the center of the room stood an altar made of black stone, its surface stained dark with substances Samuel didn't want to contemplate. Around the altar, the Moorfield family had arranged themselves in a circle, all of them completely naked and holding hands. Ezekiel stood at the head of the altar, reading from an ancient leather-bound book in a language that sounded like no earthly tongue Samuel had ever heard. But it was what lay on the altar that made Samuel's blood freeze in his veins. A young man, Peter, the newest servant Mercy had mentioned, was bound spread-eagle on the stone surface. He was alive but barely conscious, his eyes rolling back in his head as if he'd been drugged. Blood trickled from small cuts all over his body, forming intricate patterns that matched the symbols on the walls. Samuel pressed himself against the wall, hidden in the shadows of the corridor entrance, and forced himself to watch as the ceremony continued. Constance stepped forward, her pregnant belly grotesquely swollen in the torchlight, and began to chant in the same unknown language. The other family members joined in, their voices creating a harmony that was beautiful and terrible at the same time. As the chanting reached a crescendo, Jeremiah approached the altar carrying a curved knife that gleamed wickedly in the firelight. Samuel realized with horror that he was about to witness a human sacrifice, but before he could move or cry out, something even more disturbing happened. The family members began to couple with each other around the altar, father with daughters, mother with sons, siblings with siblings, while continuing their chant. Their movements were ritualistic, almost dance-like, but the wrongness of it made Samuel's soul recoil. This wasn't just murder they were planning, it was some kind of perverted religious ceremony that combined human sacrifice with the most forbidden forms of intimacy. Samuel knew he should flee, should run back to town and try to convince someone, anyone, to help him stop this atrocity. But he was frozen in place, transfixed by the sheer evil of what he was witnessing. The chanting grew louder, the family's movements more frenzied, and Jeremiah raised the knife high above Peter's chest. That's when Samuel noticed he wasn't alone in the shadows. "Fascinating, isn't it?" a voice whispered beside him. Samuel spun around to find Cain Moorfield standing just inches away, completely naked, and smiling that same cold smile his father had worn. The old ways are so much more honest than what passes for religion these days. Before Samuel could react, strong hands grabbed him from behind. Caleb, the other twin, had somehow circled around behind him. Samuel tried to struggle, but more family members emerged from hidden alcoves around the chamber. They had known he was coming, had been waiting for him. "Welcome, Reverend," Ezekiel called out, never pausing in his reading from the ancient book. "We've been expecting you. In fact, you're just in time to participate in our most sacred ritual." Samuel was dragged into the circle and forced to his knees beside the altar. Up close, he could see that Peter was still alive but barely breathing. The young man's eyes found Samuel's, and in them the minister saw a plea for death, for release from whatever torment he was enduring. "You see, Reverend," Ezekiel continued, finally closing the book, "our family has been practicing these rituals for over a century. My grandfather brought them from the old country, ancient rites that predate Christianity by thousands of years. We worship older gods, gods who understand that power comes through blood, through the joining of flesh, through the sacrifice of the weak to strengthen the strong." "This is madness," Samuel gasped. "This is evil beyond comprehension." "Evil?" Constance laughed, her voice echoing strangely in the stone chamber. "We are the chosen ones, Reverend. Our bloodline carries power that your weak Christian God could never provide. Through our sacred unions, through our offerings, we maintain that power." Jeremiah stepped closer, still holding the knife. "The question is, Reverend, will you join us willingly, or will you join our friend here on the altar?" Samuel looked around the circle at the family members, all of them watching him with those same cold, pale eyes. He thought of Mercy, safely hidden in the church, and of Tommy Brennan's broken spirit, and of all the other young people who had disappeared into this nightmare. "I'll never be part of your abomination," he said firmly. Ezekiel nodded as if he'd expected this answer. "Then you'll serve us in another way. You see, Reverend, our rituals require fresh blood, young blood, to maintain their power. Peter here has served admirably, but we need more." The family members began to close in around Samuel, their naked bodies glistening with sweat and something else. Something that looked like oil but smelled of sulfur and decay. He realized that this had all been planned, that his visit 3 days ago had marked him as their next victim. But as Jeremiah raised the knife and the family began their chant again, Samuel heard something that gave him hope. The sound of horses approaching the house above and men's voices calling out in the night. Mercy had not waited passively in the church. She had gone to the next county, to authorities who didn't owe their positions to Moorfield money, and convinced them to investigate. Samuel's plan to gather evidence had failed, but his sacrifice might not be in vain if help had finally arrived. The question was whether it would arrive in time to save him, or whether he would join the other victims in whatever unholy ground lay beyond the cellar walls. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the cellar as the front door of the Moorfield house was smashed open above. Heavy boots thundered across the floors, and authoritative voices shouted commands. The family members froze in their ritual circle, their chant dying away as the reality of discovery set in. "Federal marshals," a voice boomed from upstairs. "This property is under investigation by order of the United States government." Ezekiel's face contorted with rage. "Impossible," he snarled. "We own everyone in this county. No one would dare." "The girl," Constance hissed, her pregnant belly heaving as she breathed heavily. "That little whore went to the Federals." Samuel felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. Mercy had indeed sought help, but she'd gone beyond local authorities to federal marshals, men who couldn't be bought or intimidated by Moorfield money. However, he was still trapped in a cellar with a family of murderous degenerates who now had nothing left to lose. Jeremiah still held the knife above Peter's chest, but his attention was divided between his intended victim and the sounds of the search above. "Father, what do we do?" "We finish this," Ezekiel declared, grabbing the ancient book and beginning to chant again, faster now, more desperately. "The ritual must be completed. Our power depends on it." The family members tried to resume their positions, but the spell was broken. Some of them glanced nervously toward the cellar entrance, while others seemed to be in a trance-like state, swaying to Ezekiel's increasingly frantic chanting. Samuel saw his chance. With the family distracted, he lunged forward and grabbed Jeremiah's wrist, trying to wrestle the knife away from the young man. They struggled beside the altar, and Samuel could hear Peter's labored breathing as the bound man fought to stay conscious. "Help!" Samuel shouted as loudly as he could. "Down here! In the cellar!" His cry was answered almost immediately by the sound of boots on the stone steps. The family members scattered like roaches when a light is turned on, some fleeing toward what Samuel assumed were other exits, others grabbing weapons from hidden alcoves around the chamber. The first marshal to enter the chamber was a tall, grizzled man with a grey beard and hard eyes that had seen too much violence. He took in the scene. The naked family members, the symbols on the walls, the bound victim on the altar. And his expression didn't change, though Samuel saw his jaw tighten. "Marshal Thompson, Federal Authority," he announced calmly, drawing his pistol. "Everyone step away from the altar and put your hands where I can see them." Ezekiel laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You have no authority here, Marshal. This is sacred ground, protected by laws older than your government." "The only law I recognize is the one that says murder is a crime," Thompson replied. "And from what I can see, you folks have been breaking that law quite regularly." More marshals poured into the chamber, their weapons drawn. Samuel counted at least 6 men, all of them looking like they'd seen combat and weren't easily intimidated. Behind them came Mercy, her face pale but determined, and an older man in a suit, who Samuel assumed was some kind of federal prosecutor. "That's him," Mercy said, pointing at Ezekiel. "That's the one who leads them. And there," she indicated the altar, "that's where they do their killings." Jeremiah suddenly broke free from Samuel's grip and raised the knife high, preparing to plunge it into Peter's heart. "The sacrifice must be completed," he screamed. Marshal Thompson's pistol barked once, and Jeremiah spun around, the knife flying from his hand as the bullet shattered his shoulder. He collapsed beside the altar, screaming in pain and rage. "Anyone else want to test federal marksmanship?" Thompson asked mildly. The other family members seemed to deflate, the fight going out of them as they realized their situation was hopeless. Constance sank to her knees, her hands protectively covering her swollen belly. The twins raised their hands in surrender, though their pale eyes still burned with hatred. Only Delilah and Bathsheba continued to resist, backing toward what appeared to be another exit. "There's no escape," the prosecutor said, stepping forward. "We have this entire property surrounded. Federal agents are already searching the grounds, and I suspect they're going to find evidence of multiple murders." Samuel quickly moved to the altar and began untying Peter's bonds. The young man was barely conscious, his body covered in ritual cuts, but he was alive. "Get a doctor," Samuel called out. "This man needs immediate medical attention." As the marshals began arresting the family members, Samuel noticed that Ezekiel was still clutching the ancient book. The old man's eyes had taken on a wild, desperate look. "You don't understand," Ezekiel said, his voice rising to a shriek. "Our family is chosen. We carry the blood of the old gods. Without our rituals, without our sacrifices, the darkness will return." "The only darkness here is what you've created," Samuel replied firmly. "Your old gods are nothing but demons, and your rituals are abominations." Ezekiel's face twisted with fury. "You know nothing, preacher. Our power is real. Our bloodline is sacred." He opened the book and began chanting in that strange language again, his voice echoing off the stone walls. For a moment, Samuel felt something. A pressure in the air, a sense of malevolent presence gathering in the shadows beyond the torchlight. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop, and several of the marshals looked around nervously. But then Marshal Thompson stepped forward and struck Ezekiel across the face with the butt of his pistol. The old man collapsed, the book falling from his hands and skittering across the stone floor. "That's enough of that nonsense," Thompson said. "Book him for murder, conspiracy, and whatever other charges the prosecutor can think of." As the family members were led away in shackles, Samuel helped carry Peter up from the cellar. The young man was taken to a wagon where a doctor was waiting, and Samuel was relieved to hear that his injuries, while serious, weren't life-threatening. The prosecutor, who introduced himself as James Morrison, took Samuel aside as the arrests were being completed. "Reverend, we're going to need your testimony about what you witnessed here tonight," Morrison said. "This case is going to be difficult enough to prosecute without people thinking we're dealing with some kind of supernatural nonsense." "What I witnessed was evil in its purest form," Samuel replied. "Whether you call it supernatural or simply human depravity doesn't matter. What matters is that justice is served." Over the next several hours, as dawn broke over the Tennessee hills, the full extent of the Moorfield family's crimes became clear. Federal agents searching the property found the remains of at least 12 people buried in the woods near Dunbar Cave. Personal belongings of missing servants and travelers were discovered hidden throughout the house and outbuildings. In the cellar, investigators found detailed records of the family's rituals dating back 3 generations, written in a mixture of English and what appeared to be an ancient European dialect. The records documented not just the murders, but the systematic abuse of servants and the incestuous relationships that had produced several generations of increasingly unstable offspring. Mercy was placed under federal protection and would serve as the prosecution's key witness. Tommy Brennan and several other survivors were located and agreed to testify about their experiences at the Moorfield estate. As for the family members themselves, they were transported to Nashville to await trial. Ezekiel and Constance would eventually be hanged for murder, while their children received various prison sentences. The estate was seized by the federal government and eventually sold. Though it took years to find a buyer willing to live on the property, Samuel remained in Clarksville for several more months, helping the community heal from the trauma of learning what had been happening in their midst. The church was packed every Sunday as people sought spiritual guidance in the aftermath of such profound evil. But late at night, alone in the parsonage, Samuel sometimes found himself thinking about Ezekiel's final words, about ancient gods and sacred bloodlines. He had seen enough evil in that cellar to last several lifetimes, but he had also felt something else, a presence that seemed to respond to the old man's chanting, something that existed beyond human understanding. Samuel never spoke of these doubts to anyone, but they haunted him for the rest of his life. He had helped bring justice to the victims of the Moorfield family, but he couldn't shake the feeling that their evil had been part of something larger, something that would find new vessels to carry on its work. The Moorfield estate stood empty for years after the trials, slowly falling into ruin. Local people avoided the area, claiming they could still hear sounds coming from the direction of Dunbar Cave on moonless nights. Eventually, the property was sold to developers who tore down the house and built a small town on the site. But even today, more than a century and a half later, residents of that area sometimes report strange dreams, unexplained disappearances, and the occasional discovery of old bones in the woods. The Moorfield family is long dead, but some say their legacy lives on, waiting for the right bloodline, the right circumstances to rise again. Samuel Whitmore served as a minister for 40 more years, but he never forgot the lessons he learned in that Tennessee cellar. Evil, he came to understand, was not just the absence of good, it was an active force that could corrupt even the most sacred bonds of family and faith. And sometimes, the only way to fight such darkness was to shine the brightest light possible into its deepest corners, no matter the cost to oneself. The most horrific intimate practices of the Moorfield family had finally been exposed, their victims given justice, and their reign of terror ended. But the scars they left on the community and on the souls of those who survived their depravity would last for generations to come.